Hey, everybody. Welcome back. A little bit of a morbid topic this week, but it's one that's important and ongoing as a national debate that pertains to healthcare ethics. And that is the debate over the ethical permissibility of active euthanasia. That's the one that's kind of raging now. And also, we'll look at some discussion surrounding what is called passive euthanasia. Culturally, at least, we've kind of reached a consensus on that is morally permissible. So we're going to focus a little bit more on active as it compares to passive, as James Rachel's, our author, does. Quick note about that Rachel's text. I chose it because it's a truncated, shortened version of the original article. Um, but it does have some typos. So I apologize for the typos, but I thought all things considered, it was a little better than giving you the full original article, which goes into a level of detail that maybe is more than necessary for our purposes. All right. So having said that, I'm going to share my screen and I'm going to bounce back and forth a little bit this time between just talking to you and looking at an online website and looking at some PowerPoints that I created. All right. First, I want to show you a little map. Um, this is, and as named by the website, the Death with Dignity map. Okay, so this is on deathwithdignity.org. And what it does is it shows you which states, those are the ones in blue, Montana, Washington, Oregon, California, New Mexico, and over in the east, Maine and Vermont, that allow what is called doctor-assisted suicide, which is a little bit of a misnomer. The doctor is not actually present, but what happens is a doctor will prescribe poison that the patient will then ingest, ending their life if they're terminally ill and if they meet a bunch of other qualifications. In this week's discussion board, I am going to give you the Oregon Death with Dignity Act to kind of look at and make comments on so you can become more familiar with the details of what these acts look like. Okay, now, um, red states, these are states that are actively considering in their legislatures whether or not to have a Death with Dignity Act. And in Colorado, uh, legislation has been enacted, but it hasn't become live yet. So it's like it's coming soon kind of thing. All right. But we want to know if this is morally speaking a good idea or not. And Rachel's is going to help us think through some of these issues. All right. So let me switch it. I'm sharing. Um, all right. So James Rachel starts with a couple of definitions. One is active euthanasia. That's what we've labeled doctor-assisted suicide. That's deliberately bringing about the death of a terminally ill patient through the use of poisons or other means in order to prevent further suffering. And this is thought by many to be impermissible. As you have seen on that map we just pulled up, only a few states allow this. A lot of states are considering it. So there's a kind of growing movement behind it. We want to know, is that a good thing or a bad thing? Are there strong moral arguments that favor the moral permissibility of active euthanasia, or is it a mistake? Okay. And active euthanasia is contrasted with, sorry about that, with passive euthanasia, which is deliberately ceasing to treat a terminal illness or a terminally ill patient so as to let the patient die sooner than they otherwise would due to the disease. Okay. And this is thought to be permissible. And you can see that clearly when just imagine you've been diagnosed with cancer yourself. let's say it's treatable, you just opt not to get the chemo or other radiation therapy. And yeah, it seems like that's within the range of the morally permissible for you to forego treatment. Well, let's say you've started treatment, and as you're going along, you change your mind. And let's say it's even probable that the treatment will prolong your life. It just so happens the side effects are so intense that you've opted to just kind of live out your life, maybe do mostly hospice or pain management, and just cease the treatment. Again, some people might disagree with the wisdom of the choice. You might have concerned friends and family members that wish you did otherwise. But upon reflection, I think we have reached a consensus that people should have the autonomy to make that sort of decision for themselves. And if someone is completely comatose, we do think if they're irreversibly comatose, you can pull the plug and let their life run out. Okay. So what Rachel's wants to do is say, look, we already allow passive euthanasia. There's no good reason to not allow active in some cases. Indeed, he argues in some cases it's actually more humane. Okay, so this leads us kind of like to the main point. So I'm not going to systematically go through the reading questions this time, but everything in these slides pertains to those reading questions and answers them. Okay. So does Rachel's think killing is worse than letting die? He does not. He thinks it is often more humane to kill a patient, in other words, active euthanasia, than to let them die slowly. And the first example he uses to illustrate this is the case of someone with very painful throat cancer who has a very short life expectancy. He says, okay, well, if we're engaging in passive euthanasia, we're not treating the cancer, and perhaps the patient is choosing death by a kind of dehydration starvation method, and they're just letting go of life, but no one's actively killing them. And he points out, look, this is a slow, painful process, a lot of unnecessary suffering here. So if you were to allow active euthanasia, the administering of a poison, maybe that'd be better. Or he argues it would be better. He thinks it's clearly better, since the person's going to die shortly anyway, to skip the prolonged agonizing suffering part right at the end of the life, if that's what the patient chooses. So that's the argument there, and that's kind of his general point. It's more humane to do the active as opposed to the passive. All right. He also discusses a case of a baby born with Down syndrome, and he wants to say, so here's the case description. Children with Down syndrome are often born with another medical problem, such that if it were left untreated, the baby would die. So he gives the example of a couple that had a baby. The baby had Down syndrome, and it also had an intestinal blockage that could easily be removed. And what the doctors did was like they decided not to remove, in consultation with the parents, they all decided, let's let the baby die due to the intestinal blockage. And they argued, well, that's acceptable because that's passive euthanasia. We're not actively killing the baby, we're just letting it die. Um, so that happened, and that still happens from time to time. Now, here's Rachel's point. First, he says, look, he thinks it's reasonable to argue that one must repair the intestinal blockage and preserve the life of the baby with Down syndrome. He gets the logic behind that. Yeah, and if you ever met someone with Down syndrome, they're not constantly miserable. They do have They often have a very, very decent quality of life, similar to the Margot person we talked about. Not, they're not as intellectual. Um, they don't mature into full adulthood, but they're not simply sitting there suffering all the time. And Rachel's gets that. You can make a strong moral case that there's an obligation to repair the blockage and save the life of the Down syndrome child. But he also says, look, this isn't really my main point. I can also see the argument that it's morally permissible to end the life of the baby with Down syndrome. Some people argue, sure, the Down syndrome person is not suffering, but that person has a low enough quality of life that it's permissible to end it. Um, and again, this article is not on Down syndrome and that sort of issue. So Rachel's doesn't take a stand here. He says, I see the logic of both positions. But he does say this: if it is morally permissible to let a baby with Down syndrome pass away, then it is also ethical to deliberately bring about their death. And he says it's even actually morally better to do it deliberately than to just let the child die. Same reason as the throat cancer case. This is because it's less painful, more humane, it's over quick, so on and so forth. Now, in relation to the details of this specific case, he says, look, if you're letting the baby die due to the intestinal blockage, it's slow, it's painful, and it's also, how do I phrase this? Um, it causes the doctors and the parents to ignore the main question, which is, should the life of the baby be preserved or should it not? The baby doesn't actually have a terminal illness in this sort of case. The blockage can easily be removed and the baby can survive and grow into a child and perhaps even adulthood. So by allowing this distinction to linger, passive euthanasia is acceptable, active is not, the doctors and parents kind of fool themselves into saying, well, since we're letting the child die of the intestinal blockage, we're doing something like passive euthanasia. And Rachel's point is, oh, actually, this is not a case of passive euthanasia. This is a case of letting a treatable illness go and letting the baby die. Um, so this distinction is just causing confusion in this case. It's preventing doctors and parents from asking themselves, should the baby live? Should the baby die? And the focus becomes, oh, look, there's an intestinal blockage. I guess we can just let that kill the child. Our hands are clean. It's just passive euthanasia, and that's fine. Again, you get Rachel's point that's not fine. That's not even the main moral issue. It's more like an excuse than a reason. Okay. All right. Now, Rachel's has given a compassion-based argument for doing active as opposed to passive. It's often quicker, causes less suffering. Now he wants to show in a more general way that the distinction between killing and letting die isn't a very good distinction. It doesn't capture anything morally important. Okay. So here's the argument. So on this slide, P is for premise. Premise is simply a reason to believe a conclusion. So premise one, Smith, who kills his cousin in the bathtub to get his inheritance, does something morally awful. So you've read the text. Smith has a 6-year-old cousin. He walks in, his cousin's taking a bath. He drowns him, and he gets his cousin's money in the will instead of his cousin getting it. All right. Premise two, Jones, who intends to kill his cousin but realizes he has hit his head and will drown on his own, and deliberately lets him drown, does something equally morally awful. All right. So if both premise one and premise two are true, Rachel says, look, this conclusion follows. Killing is no worse than letting die. Now, just so you know, there are critics of this argument. The main criticism is that Jones, even though he doesn't literally hold his cousin underwater and actively kill him, well, he walked in with the intent of killing his cousin. Whereas typically, if someone's going to let die instead of kill, they have no intent to end the life of the person. So, for example, let's say you are walking by a pond and you look over and there's a kid drowning and you don't intervene. That's bad. I mean, you really should grab the kid and pull him out of the water. But it's not quite as bad, the critics say, as grabbing a kid and holding his head underwater until he dies. That actually does seem morally worse. But if we bring this back into a medical context where the motive is very different, the motive in both active and passive euthanasia is actually not to bring about the death of the patient, it's actually to prevent the patient from suffering. Now, bringing about their death is a means to that end for sure, but there's nothing fundamentally misanthropic or mean or cruel going on. In both cases, the intent is to do something good for the person, maybe misguided. Again, the debate over this is ongoing, but it's not like these cases where one is deliberately harming someone for a selfish motive. The motive in euthanasia cases is to reduce the suffering of the person with the illness. Okay. So that's what you should be thinking about. Both active and passive euthanasia do result in the patient dying. The motive is at least positive. It's to reduce the suffering of the patient. So ask yourself, in that context, is it really better to let someone die and let their suffering end that way? Or is it perhaps morally superior that they are able to access some sort of toxin or poison to bring about that death in a quicker way? And in order to aid your reflection on that question, like I said, I'm going to post the Oregon Death with Dignity Act in the discussion board, and I'm going to give you some questions that you need to address within that discussion board that get you to interact with that document. All right. So this is an issue that you'll face as medical care professionals, I guess, depending on what role you play in the hospital. You yourselves, people you love and care about, they may have to think this through someday. So I hope you found this a useful discussion. All right, thank you. And I'm taking a second to stop share. And I'm going to stop the recording and upload it. All right, have a good one.